Putin and Zelensky are both preparing for next war. Right now, as you're watching this, missiles are falling on Kyiv. Drones are burning oil terminals in Russia. And according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Russia alone has suffered close to 1.4 million casualties since this war began. That's more people than the entire population of Estonia. But here's what almost nobody is talking about. Both Moscow and Kyiv have already accepted something that should terrify the rest of the world. This war is going to end. But the fighting isn't. Because in the minds of the men running both countries, this isn't the final war between Russia and Ukraine. It's only the second one. Think about that for a second. Two nations have already lost more people combined than most modern wars in history, and both sides are quietly convinced this isn't even the final chapter. It's the middle one. To understand why, we have to rewind to 2014. That's when Russia annexed Crimea and pushed into Ukraine's eastern Donbas region, starting a lower-grade conflict that most of the world barely noticed. For almost 8 years, that war stayed contained. Around 14,000 people died. Compare that to today's numbers, and it barely registers. But that quiet war in the Donbas wasn't really a separate event. It was preparation. Russia built supply lines into eastern Ukraine, developed the logistics it would eventually need for a full invasion, and tested how far it could push before the West actually responded. It also kept a card in reserve, the threat of formally recognizing separatist territories, without playing that card until just days before the full invasion began. Ukraine used the same 8 years differently. It built what would later become known as its fortress belt, a chain of heavily defended cities across the Donbas. It rebuilt a military that had been hollowed out for decades, and started forming the security relationships with Western capitals that would matter enormously come 2022. Neither side achieved its actual goal in that first war. Russia never secured international recognition for Crimea. Ukraine never pushed Russian-backed forces out of its territory. So both sides did the only thing left. They kept preparing for round two. That round two is the war we're watching today. And according to military analysts and intelligence assessments across NATO, a third round is already being planned, on both sides, before this one even ends. So why would two exhausted nations, after years of devastating losses, choose to prepare for round three instead of peace? Start with Ukraine. Its former commander-in-chief, General Valery Zelensky, now serves as Ukraine's ambassador to the UK. When asked directly whether he plans to run for president, he brushed it off publicly, calling it barely worth discussing until martial law ends. But behind closed doors, reports from Ukrainska Pravda describe a very different picture. Zelensky reportedly summoned him to Kyiv this year, specifically to ask whether he'd run in a future election. Polling suggests Zelensky could beat Zelensky outright. And what makes him dangerous to Moscow isn't politics. It's his worldview. He's publicly said Ukraine can't count on some miracle to restore its old borders. Instead, he frames the future as a permanent, technology-driven contest with Russia, one that never really ends, only evolves. That single detail matters more than it sounds. A general who's popular enough to challenge a sitting wartime president and who openly frames the future as an endless technological contest rather than a war that gets won and finished, is shaping how an entire country thinks about what comes next. If Zelensky does eventually run and win, Ukraine's next president will be someone who has already told the public, in public, that this isn't over. Now look at Russia. Even as Russian territorial gains have slowed to a crawl, gaining barely 37 square miles across the first half of this year, according to the Institute for the Study of War, the ideological machinery behind the war hasn't slowed at all. Long-time Kremlin-aligned thinkers have spent decades arguing that Russia's future as a global power is simply impossible unless Ukraine is absorbed back into its orbit. That idea didn't start this war, and it isn't going to end just because this war does. Both countries have built entire economies and identities around this conflict. Russia has shifted deep into a war economy, one where military production and conflict itself have become the engine keeping the broader economy moving. Pull that engine out, and Russia has to find something else to hold the system together. Ukraine, meanwhile, has built the most experienced, most Western integrated military it has ever had in its history. Neither government can simply walk away from those investments without risking serious instability at home. Here's where it gets more urgent. As of this month, peace talks are stalled. Ukrainian negotiators met with U.S. officials in Miami to discuss a possible deal, but both countries ended up announcing ceasefires for different dates, and neither side accepted the terms the other proposed. Meanwhile, Germany just funded 50,000 attack drones for Ukraine, one of the largest single drone purchases any Western government has made for Kyiv so far. Ukraine has also started building its own Patriot missile interceptors domestically for the first time, instead of relying entirely on the United States to supply them. None of that sounds like a country preparing to stand down. It sounds like a country preparing to fight a longer war on its own terms. And Russia is doing its own version of the same thing, rebuilding what it's losing on the battlefield through sheer industrial output, even as its casualty rate climbs to levels the country hasn't seen since World War II. And that's the part that should worry you. European intelligence agencies have reportedly warned that within the next few years, Russia may test NATO directly with a limited strike. Not to seize territory, but to see how far the alliance's promises actually stretch. If that promise breaks even slightly, the next war won't stay contained to Russia and Ukraine. It pulls in the entire European security order. So when this current war eventually ends, likely with a ceasefire that freezes the front line roughly where it stands, don't expect celebrations to last. Expect both nations to spend that pause the same way they spent the 8 years between 2014 and 2022. Rebuilding, rearming, and waiting. Ukraine will keep expanding its long-range strike capability and push harder for binding security guarantees from the West. Russia will use any pause to rebuild its shattered military-industrial base and prepare for a larger mobilization it has so far avoided. Neither side believes peace is permanent. And history suggests that when both sides in a conflict expect the next war before the current one even ends, that expectation has a habit of becoming true. This war will end. But if you're expecting it to be the last chapter, you might want to think again. Because in Kyiv and in Moscow, everyone already knows this story isn't over. They're just waiting to see who writes the next part first.